Thousands of local and national journalists and photographers are on the ground in Chicago this week, and they're capturing every moment that's happening both inside and outside the DNC. But along with fears that protesters' rights will be violated, advocates say that press freedom is also at stake this week. Now, this isn't just an issue for reporters. It's a concern for the public, who actually rely on journalists to report on the convention accurately. So to discuss further, we're joined by Seth Stern, who's Director of Advocacy for the Freedom of the Press Foundation. Welcome back to Reset, Seth.
Great to be here.
And also here is freelance journalist Isabelle Senechal, who has written a guide for covering protests in a solutions-oriented way. Hey, Isabelle.
Hi, Sasha.
So I'll start with you. Tell us some of the issues that journalists can run into as they cover protests.
Yeah, so I think one of the big things that journalists have to keep in mind is safety. Protests are high-stress situations. They can quickly escalate. And so you really need to have a safety risk assessment plan before you arrive to cover the protest in case things go south.
And we'll talk more about what would be included in that safety risk assessment plan. Seth, the city plans to streamline mass arrests by processing people who've been arrested at a makeshift court. This is at the Area 3 police station that's nearby. What do you think of that?
Well, when it comes to journalists, even streamlined, call them catch and release arrests, are a threat to their ability to do their jobs because, to state the obvious, you can't report the news while you're being detained. And there's a common misconception that I'm concerned about in light of that plan, that when a protest is dispersed, even when a protest is lawfully dispersed because things really are out of hand and people are breaking laws, that journalists can be dispersed along with protesters and arrested if they fail to disperse. That's really not the law. The Department of Justice even made that clear in its report on the Department of Justice's on the Minneapolis police response to protests following George Floyd's murder. The aftermath of a protest is every bit as much the news as the protest itself. The police response to a protest is a huge part of the story. That story can't get out if journalists are dispersed along with protesters.
Yeah, so you're saying in these mass dispersal orders, reporters are impacted because it sounds like officers, they don't always realize that journalists don't have to comply with those orders. Is that right?
Exactly.
This is also important for the rights of protesters, Isabelle. Like, if journalists aren't around to report on these violations, that's an issue, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when journalists are present at protests, it provides more safety for demonstrators because we have people documenting what is happening in case any abuses happen that law enforcement do against protesters. Also, it's within the public interest to be able to cover protests because we're sharing these stories of what is going on in these issues, and it's important for the public to be informed about what's going on.
Yeah, I'm also thinking, Seth, about pressure in the moment to hand over your phone or your notebook or your recordings to police, which violates press freedom, but can also threaten their sources, right? The reporter's sources. So what sorts of protections do journalists have when it comes to something like that?
So the Privacy Protection Act of 1980 is a federal law that prohibits searches and seizures of journalists' phones, files, devices used for news gathering purposes, even with a warrant, except if the journalist is suspected or being investigated for a crime that does not involve news gathering. So claiming a journalist trespassed in order to get a photo, or claiming that a journalist got too close to police to record an arrest, that is in the course of news gathering. You can't use that as a workaround to the Privacy Protection Act. Journalists are not required to hand their phones over to police. They're not required to unlock their phones with their faces or their thumbprints. Searches of journalists' phones pursuant to an arrest at a trespass are illegal under the PPA. It got a lot of attention when the Marion County Record was raided last year because that was a very dramatic raid involving an entire police department descending on a newsroom.
Right.
But a search of a journalist's phone at a protest is every bit as illegal under the PPA as the Marion County Record raid.
So how should the police be responding to journalists? And I'd love to hear from you both on this. What are your immediate thoughts, Isabelle?
My immediate thoughts are that the police should try not to intervene as much as possible. I think when police intervene, it tends to escalate things. You know, a lot of these protesters have their own safety members, they have their own mediators and legal representation there.
Mm-hmm.
And it's better to just let the public action happen than to engage. The other thing to keep in mind, too, is that it's very easy to get tunnel vision when you're in a protest, and especially for police officers because they're in a high pressure situation. And so, you know, if I were a police officer, I would just try not to engage as much as possible.
You mean
and
with
to
the journalists?
With the journalists
doing their work?
With the journalists doing their work. Identify who they are and, you know, don't go after them.
Seth, would you agree?
I would agree. And officers should keep in mind that in the event that there is a dispute over what happened on the ground, it's useful potentially to them, if they're in the right, to have journalists present. Anyone who doesn't have anything to hide should want journalists present to document what happened so that we're not dependent on snippets of 15-second videos that people post on TikTok and on X.
Mm-hmm.
You should want credible, reliable people who know what they're doing and can provide context to do so. So in that sense, I think officers should welcome journalists. I do understand that it is difficult to distinguish between journalists and protesters at times, especially when you're dealing with independent journalists, citizen journalists, people who aren't wearing a big press vest or who aren't easily identifiable.
Yeah.
But the best way to get around that is to be measured in responding to the protest in the first place. If you're only singling out lawbreakers, which is what the First Amendment requires, and you're not going after peaceful protesters and you're not kettling and mass dispersing people who are exercising their rights, then you're not going to have to worry so much about distinguishing journalists from lawmakers. That won't be what's on your mind. What's on your mind is going to be distinguishing lawbreakers from non-lawbreakers.
Right.
And if that's the distinction you're making, it doesn't matter.
Yeah. So, Isabelle, going back to what you alluded to earlier, you talked about that safety first, right? How can journalists approach this protest coverage with that solutions lens and, you know, also, you know, help to be able to be identified, to Seth's point?
Yeah, definitely. So before going out to cover a protest, I would make a safety plan and risk assessment with your editor. Make sure that your editor knows where you're going to be, what your check-in plan is. Another trick I like to do is in the event that you do get detained while covering protests, keep a piece of paper in your shoe that has the the Committee for Reporters' Freedom. Sorry, I'm blanking on the exact organization, but there is a legal hotline for journalists that you can reach out to and call in the event that you do get detained and need to get legal representation.
Yes.
So be prepared for that.
We've sent out our BEZ and sometimes reporters with a similar, you know, they've got a little card on their person that sort of reminds them of these things and has the important phone numbers that they need as well. If they are detained or, you know, take their access to their phones or anything is taken, you know, without their consent.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm also thinking of the independent and citizen journalists that you brought up, Seth. You know, they don't necessarily have that big fancy equipment, as you talked about, right? And they don't have things to show that they're a reporter. So this could affect the policing aspect of things.
Yes, it is an added challenge for police officers to distinguish citizen journalists. But if someone's not actively participating in the protest, if someone's observing, recording, whether on a giant fancy camera or on an iPhone, they're exercising protected rights. The right to record police, the right to document protests is not limited to institutional press. When the First Amendment was drafted, there was no such thing as the institutional press. Nobody was thinking about whether you've got a New York Times press pass. So anyone who's there to peacefully document the protests and the law enforcement response to the protests should be protected. And again, the best way for police to do that is to not treat everyone as a monolith, to not mass arrest, mass disperse protesters, to focus on people who are committing serious crimes, not petty stuff. You know, don't do the things we see sometimes where anyone whose foot slips off the sidewalk that they're authorized to be on is immediately trespassed, focus on people who are really posing a risk to public safety. Everyone else understand that it's a chaotic situation. Not everyone is going to make every perfect footstep.
So leave us with this then. Your advice to someone who does experience or see a press freedom violation. What should they do?
Well, Isabelle already hit on one of the first things they should do, which is contact the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press. They've got a phone line.
Yeah.
They've got an email tip submission form. There's also the U.S. Press Freedom Tracker, which our foundation, Freedom of the Press Foundation, operates. That is a database that documents press freedom violations ranging from arrests to assaults to searches and seizures of phones, equipment damage. Contact them. They've got a tips site that if you Google the Press Freedom Tracker, you'll find. There is the Chicago Police's COPA, Citizens Oversight something or other, which processes citizen complaints of officer misconduct. In the past, a lot of journalists have not bothered reporting incidents to them.
I was just going to ask you that. I mean, do journalists actually do that? Do they tend to report these violations? What have you seen, Isabelle?
I think that's more of a question for...
Yeah, I can't say whether they generally do, whether the majority do or don't. I can say, though, that the Press Freedom Tracker has documented a few incidents, well, plenty nationwide and some in Chicago specifically, where journalists said either they didn't want to report because they thought it would be a waste of time, or they didn't want to report because they thought they'd be putting a target on their backs. And that's another, when we get back to journalists identifying themselves as such, officers should keep in mind sometimes when protests get rowdy, journalists don't want to identify as press because they're afraid of being involved in conflicts with the protesters who might have anti-press sentiments or counter-protesters. So same thing. Journalists might not wear a press vest because they don't want to raise any red flags with protesters and counter-protesters. Journalists might not want to report to the police because they don't want to mark themselves as a troublemaker. That's a decision for individual journalists to make.
Yeah.
I think it's best to report, but if you don't want to report to police, report to the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press, report to the Press Freedom Tracker.
We'll have to leave it there. We've been talking to Seth Stern, who's Director of Advocacy for the Freedom of the Press Foundation, and freelance journalist Isabelle Senechal about how violations of journalists' rights can impact their coverage and the public. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's it for Reset. I'm Sasha-Ann Simons. Thanks for listening today, and have a good one. We'll meet again tomorrow.